Hey everybody, Deathlade here. I'm going to be talking today about a term that comes up in the novels that I translate by the author Argun, and I'm not really sure how other translators handle this term. I'm going to get in a little bit of detail about why I translate it this way and a few other tidbits relating to the process of coming up with this term. First of all, let me explain for those of you who aren't very familiar with these xianxia Chinese fantasy novels, how they kind of work, at least with my author. The novels are about cultivation, so they cultivate spiritually to become immortal, basically, is kind of the crux of most of the stories. When it comes to how that cultivation exactly works, there are usually different aspects that any person can cultivate. The author that I translate, Argun, he basically splits it up into three main sections. So one of those sections is what I translate as the cultivation base, which is sort of like the internal spiritual aspect of a person. Then there is what I tend to translate as divine sense, which is basically like the mind, like psychic abilities. And then there is the physical body. And a lot of times the people who cultivate that physical body will become extremely muscular, but not necessarily. They fight, hand to hand with punching, kicking. It's kind of like what we tend to think of as like martial arts. And also, I think it's very Dragon Ball Z-like. They're training in actual hand-to-hand combat techniques, except at the level where they can destroy mountains and planets with their punches and kicks. Now, when it comes to that physical body that they are cultivating, I actually translate the term that's used as a fleshly body. And there's a reason for that. The two Chinese characters which make up this term, the first one is rou, which refers to flesh, to meat, or to not necessarily to skin. There's a separate word for skin, but it's referring basically to like the muscles and the flesh inside of your body. And that's one of the reasons why I went with fleshly body as opposed to something else. The other character, Shen, is referring specifically to the body. So my translation of fleshly body is a pretty direct translation of this term. There are some reasons that went into why I picked that term. One of the reasons is that when I first encountered it, it to a large degree was connected to a specific technique that the main character, Meng Hao, of that novel was going to work on later. So the term came up kind of early on in the novel, but I knew about this technique that was coming up later, and I had put some thought into how I wanted to translate that term, and in order to make them both work together, I ended up going with fleshly body. One other reason why I went with fleshly as opposed to something else like physical body was because I felt that there was a certain contrast between the spiritual aspect and the fleshly aspect. Cultivation novels are not really religious, but they are based on Taoism, and there's supposed to be this kind of like spiritual aspect. And so when you're talking about those religious and spiritual things, the fleshly desires and the fleshly carnal things are different from the spiritual things. That was another thing that went into it. A third thing that went into it was, some people have asked, why don't you translate it as the physical body, and why don't you translate it as, for example, physique? So I've noticed a lot of translators use physique cultivation. Well, in terms of the physique, number one is I feel like there are other sort of like connotations to that word that make it not suitable to use for this fleshly body cultivation. Another reason is because at least in the author that I translate, the actual term rou shen will be used as a noun a lot. And like it'll basically say like that person's fleshly body was destroyed or it became more powerful. And I think that like if you're talking about a person's physique being destroyed, like kind of to me just doesn't really make sense. And then whether you're talking about physique or fleshly body, there's one thing that I've learned over the years of translating, at this point, something like 2,500 chapters of these fantasy novels, is that you need to be very, very careful about taking a sort of unique term that's often used in these novels and then using a term to describe it that also has a common usage in Chinese. So what I mean by that is there are other words in Chinese that can be used to indicate physique or physical body. And the thing is, for example, let's say I took this rou shen and I translated it as physical body, but then later on in the novel, it's entirely possible that there could be a play on words or a contrast using the Chinese term physical body with this other thing that I translate as fleshly body. Because of this trend, I feel that it's very important to be very careful with how you translate certain terms. So I actually violated my own rule on this in my own current translation, A Will Eternal. The main character has, actually it's ironically a fleshly body cultivation technique that I translated as the Undying Heavenly King. And what I translated as the Heavenly King in Chinese is actually a kind of a complicated term, Jinggang. And Jinggang can be translated in a lot of different ways and has different meanings. It could mean diamond. It's the word that's often used to translate King Kong. It can mean these sort of like celestial attendants to Buddha. It can also refer to these like sort of divine kings that form like a pantheon in Buddhism and Taoism. And so after doing a lot of thinking and looking at how the term was explained within the novel, I decided to go with Heavenly Kings. The Heavenly King, the Undying Heavenly King. But then several hundred chapters later in the novel, guess what? There are actual kings within this novel that have the sort of title heaven in front of them, and basically they really need to be called Heavenly Kings. There's no other way to translate it. So all of a sudden I had a conflict with two things that were called Heavenly King that were completely unrelated and should not even sound like they are related in Chinese. And so that's one of the things that can cause a problem if you choose to pick a commonly used term for some specific fantasy term that's in the novel. That's another thing that played into why I decided to go with the fleshly body. So I know I've thrown a lot of information out here. I hope it all kind of makes sense. Basically, the fleshly body is the physical body that the person cultivates. Their muscles, their arms, their legs, sometimes their bones and blood, all of the physical things that make up a person. Because these people who cultivate toward immortality have souls inside of them, both the souls in the traditional sense of the word and then other kind of like magical cultivated things, those things can often survive the destruction of their physical body or their fleshly body. And that's basically what you have with a fleshly body. If I could go back in time and come up with a different term, I don't know, I might still go with fleshly body because I like the way that it contrasts with the spiritual aspect, and I also feel that it's a pretty accurate translation according to the Chinese. That's it for this episode. I feel like I should have a catchphrase here, something like, may the cultivation be with you, or like, keep up your cultivation or something. But I really can't think of anything. I've racked my brains. My wife, Madam Deathblade, has said I should come up with something, but I just really can't think of anything. So if you guys can help me out with that, if you have any ideas, leave it in the comments below. In terms of how to support me, I do have a Patreon, and I have some ideas for upcoming videos in which I would need to buy some things that are kind of expensive. I was looking online on Taobao, which is like the Chinese kind of eBay/Amazon, for some of the props or items that I need. I want to get some of the things that appear within the Chinese fantasy novels and have actual physical representations of them that I can show you. But some of them are kind of expensive. Like, for example, certain things are only made out of jade, and jade's kind of expensive. Anyway, the point is, if you like these videos and you're interested in seeing more content like this, please go over to Patreon. You can just support me directly. You can also vote on the topics that I'm going to talk about. And of course, as a patron on Patreon, you have the ability to message me directly about anything. So go check that out. The link's below in the description. And I'll see you in the next video, and insert cool catchphrase here until I come up with a better catchphrase. See ya.